The story of the restoration, do you have any idea of the best way to format that? A timeline, perhaps, or?
The Eureka is a good example of the overall story. It's a case. It's sort of a case study within the overall story, I think, and the way we currently are approaching it and thinking about it. And then what I would do, probably, in terms of running around town, you mentioned going around town at various sites. We could go to various sites and talk about the preservation stories of those sites.
Mm-hmm.
For example, another project that I've been involved in and was in the 1970s was the adaptive reuse of the old Jonesborough High School 1927 building to a 13-unit condominium association. We did that in the late 70s. And that's up on the hill here on the right on West Main Street in the 300 block of West Main. That would be a good example to look at and talk about in terms of preservation. Also, one of my favorite themes has been doing color analysis. The building across the street is a good example of that. That was painted 3 Victorian color schemes before it became white, and that color scheme is the second, and I participated in doing the research on that by taking the local samples and then consulting with Frank Welch, who is a color analyst in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, to get him to match that to the Munsell color system. And then based on my distribution discoveries of the colors, we painted that very authentic color scheme on that building from the 1880s. And that there have been a total of about 15, 16 buildings around town that we've done similar research on and painted those buildings. So that can be fun. And then there are individual that I've been involved in, but they're individual stories. I've got stories on almost every building in town. Our enforcement of the ordinance against demolition by neglect is one that we mentioned in the context of the Eureka, but also there's a house next to the Academy Hill on the northwest corner of 2nd Avenue in Maine that we worked for 6 years, working through enforcing our ordinance against demolition by neglect before we finally got into a break. And that individual then, the owner, sold the house to Kelly Wolf, and Kelly Wolf restored it.
And what is that ordinance? I mean, what is that?
It specifically is enabled in Tennessee within historic districts to permit either a local nonprofit or entity or the town to come into a property and stabilize a property that is being allowed to go down to the point of no return. We call that demolition by neglect. But to stabilize a property to prevent it being demolished just out of neglect. The basis of demolition by neglect, or I might say the philosophy behind demolition by neglect, is the realization that buildings contribute to the historic character of a historic district such as Jonesborough's, not based on the condition of the building so much as on the building's history and its style and what it represents in that history and style and in its construction form. That means that unfortunately some buildings that have been neglected, and I think this is true in most historic districts around the country, some buildings that have been neglected and been allowed to run down really have historic value. And if they can be brought back up and again actively used and again be contributing members of the assets of the community in terms of the built environment, then they no longer would be a drag on the environment or on the neighborhood. So that's the basis of the ordinance against demolition by neglect, which permits the community to go through a number of steps, the local government to go through a number of steps through the Historic Zoning Commission of encouraging initially the property owner to stabilize a building and prevent its further deterioration by various methods of beginning early stages of encouragement and then doing a little bit of arm twisting, and then ultimately through a series of rather complex legal steps being able to go into a property and actually stabilize the building and place a lien on the property for eventual recovery after the property is sold. And here in Jonesborough, we found that the most valuable thing about having an ordinance against demolition by neglect is simply having it on the books, having the potential of being able to say to a neglectful property owner that because of where this building is located in the community and because of its value historically to the community, we can't, under the ordinance, allow the building to decline. And so the property owner needs to either repair the building or sell the building to another owner who would be willing to repair it, or face a certain number of legal proceedings that are very complex because we have to balance all of this with property rights of the individual, go through very complex proceedings in defending their continued ownership and their continued neglect of the building. As the years went by after the establishment of the historic preservation effort in the late 1960s and early 1970s, most of the buildings changed hands and were adequately restored and stabilized as the town began to take on new life. But as we emerged into the 1990s, there were a handful of buildings, specifically only 3 buildings, that were still being neglected, but still were of historic value, and this house was one of them. The owners came during the 1990s to the Jonesborough Historic Zoning Commission asking for a permit for demolition. Naturally, since the house was of historic value, the permit was denied by the Historic Zoning Commission. And simultaneous to this movement through the 90s to get this house demolished, that is the movement on the part of the owners, the town board passed an ordinance against demolition by neglect. Eventually, in working with these owners over a period of 6 years under the process of enforcing the ordinance against demolition, the owners decided to sell the house. They sold it to our present mayor, Kelly Wolf, who then restored the house and sold it to the Thomasons, Kevin and Julie Thomason. And now it stands again, beautifully restored, as one of our prime homes here in Jonesborough, and a wonderful story of how some houses that have declined can still be brought back up and still be given new life and serve new purposes and yet retain their historic character.
All right. That's good.